Welcome to Boom Bust. I'm Edward Harrison. Aaron Aid is off today. Our lead story today is Bank of America and its recent settlement for mortgage fraud. Now, this deal is being billed as the biggest post-housing bubble mortgage settlement. But before we dissect the terms of the deal, I want to review just why Bank of America is paying fines. First, back in 2008 and 2009, the U.S. government made a total of $45 billion of direct payments to Bank of America and its Merrill Lynch subsidiary to shore up the company, since $118 billion in potential losses from bank assets related to risky mortgages would have rendered B of A insolvent. These dodgy mortgages were often made on a fraudulent basis, and by 2011, Bank of America and other too big to fail U.S. financial institutions faced a blitz of lawsuits from homeowners, investors, states' attorneys general, and the U.S. government. In 2011, a list of areas for a potential prosecution was drawn up by the National Association of Attorneys General, and the areas for probing were extensive. Mortgage electronic registration systems, mortgage pools, bad securitization, misplaced mortgage notes, forced-placed insurance, illegal pyramid servicing fees, document fraud for sale, false affidavits and perjury, foreclosure mills, aka robo-signing, active military members losing homes while on tour of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, in 2013, federal judge Jed Rakoff felt the fraudulent activities were so extensive that he endorsed a broad interpretation of a rarely used savings and loan era law to go after B of A. It has a low burden of proof, strong subpoena power, and 10 years of a statute of limitation, twice as long as the typical limit for fraud cases. Given all of this, B of A settled. Now, you fast forward to today, and you see this deal is a headline $17 billion, and it's touted by the media as the largest settlement arising from the 2008 economic meltdown. Pretty good, huh? Well, hold the phone. Remember, millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure, and yet no individual was held culpable and put in jail as a part of this deal. That's number one. And the headline figure isn't even real. The banks will pay $10 in cash to investors who lost money due to the fraud associated with the mortgages in the mortgage bond pools. B of A will actually only provide relief to consumers via so-called credits valued at $7 billion. Now, the AP wrote up a piece on these so-called credits and found that under a similar deal with Citi, each dollar spent on legal aid counselors, for example, is worth $2 in credits. And paper losses on some affordable housing project loans can be credited at as much as 4 times their actual value. And the banks are getting a lot of these so-called credits for stuff they would have done anyway. So at least that's what they're telling investors. Nice. What's more is, in a similar deal with JP Chase for $4 billion of credit relief, JPM had only claimed verifiable modifications on 100 loans total for $6 million of relief 5 months into the program. And this so-called relief is treated as a taxable event by the IRS, by the way. So look, Bank of America is an institution that rewarded customer service representatives who foreclosed on homes with cash bonuses and gift cards. That's a fact. In fact, according to court documents, when supposedly trying to help homeowners in trouble through the Obama administration's vaunted HAMP relief program, service representatives were told to lie to homeowners and tell them their paperwork and payments had not been received, when in reality they had been, so that the bank could foreclose on them. And now the Justice Department and attorneys general want you to buy the concept that this settlement is justice for millions of Americans who lost their homes. Well, I'm not buying, and neither should you. We talked a lot on the show about Europe, how it's facing some tough times economically, but one of our freaking guests is not as negative as I am. Aaron got the chance to sit down with economist and author Jim Rickards to discuss where he stands on Europe and what he sees in its future. She asked him where the inflation-deflation debate is headed, considering the European economy has begun to stagnate. Here's what he had to say.
when people say record low yields, now fixed income analysts and investors have to understand, these are record low yields in nominal space. They're not record low yields in real space. For real space, you have to subtract inflation. So, for example, you could have a 10% nominal yield, 10% coupon on the bond, but if inflation is 13%, the real rate is -3. Now, right now, we have, say, 1.5% or 2% coupon on the bonds, but inflation is 0, maybe even negative, maybe even inflation. So the real rate is +1, +2. So actually, real rates are still quite high, even though nominal rates are quite low. And so for investors and analysts, you have to focus on the real rates. So these low nominal rates are a reflection of not only close to 0 inflation, but some expectation of deflation. You know, remember the 10-year note in Japan, the JGBs, they've been around 80 basis points for years. And I think the U.S. might be heading the same way. All this talk of a bond bubble, no. I mean, you could be set up for the greatest rally in 10-year Treasury notes in history if they go from like 2.4% to 1.5%. That was close the gap with European yields. That would be a great bond rally. Now, again, it's really important to distinguish between what people call low nominal rates. The real rates are still pretty high, and they can go lower.
Now, the ECB has been less aggressive than other major central banks. So how do you see it acting or reacting going forward?
Well, the thing about the ECB, and this is really important to understand, Aaron, is that they have a single mandate. The U.S. has the so-called dual mandate, which is inflation and unemployment, reducing unemployment. And the Fed has said when they come into conflict, which sometimes they do, and they are right now, you have to pick one. If you can't have them both, you have to pick one. The Fed has made it very clear, and Yellen has made it clear in her speeches, that they're going to do everything they can by printing money and QE and other techniques to try to reduce unemployment, or actually create jobs. Unemployment rate's pretty low. That's because people have dropped out of the labor force. What they want to do is create jobs and get those non-participants back into the labor force. They're just not worried about inflation. Now, in Europe, the ECB, they have a single mandate, and they take it seriously. The other thing Americans don't understand about European legal systems is that they don't have the common law, make it up as you go along system that we have. They are much more code-based, going back to the Napoleonic Code, and before that, the Code of Justinian in the 6th century. So they take these mandates seriously. So Draghi will do what he needs to do to maintain price stability, but he has no other goals in mind. Now, deflation is not price stability. If you have serious deflation, he will ease up. But right now, he's saying, you know, price indices around 0, a little bit in positive territory, so he's not going to change very much.
I love that you bring up the Napoleonic and Justinian Code. You don't hear about that much, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. So moving right along.
Got them in my library.
I love it. Really, of course you do, Jim. I love that. So got to ask you, what is the chance here that the euro falls apart?
The chance that the euro falls apart in terms of you know, members leaving, or you know, the euro breaking up, or there's been years past some speculation about a northern tier and a southern tier. That's close to 0. That's not going to happen. In fact, of course, I've been saying this for years. This is, you know, a lot of people have come around to this view. 3 years ago, I was the only person, I think, on that side of the boat. And what I said at the time was, not only is no one leaving, the euro will add members, which they've done. They've added Croatia, they've added Estonia. Now, I said something in my new book, The Death of Money, about Scotland joining the euro. And of course, you get laughed at when I say things like that, but there's an independence vote coming up in Scotland in a few days. Let's see how the vote turns out, but it wouldn't surprise me to see Scotland break away from the UK and join the euro as well. So the euro as a currency and as a political economic project is as strong as ever. Now, the cross rate between the dollar and the euro, that's going to be volatile, but you know, I think it's at the low end of the range now. I see it gathering strength and kind of, you know, chugging its way back to 140 in time.
Jim, as China turned down early in the year, it turned on these stimulus taps and ramped up industrial capacity. Now, the Daily Telegraph says it's exporting deflation into Europe, and that's why things are so sluggish. So do you agree?
Yes, China is basically exporting deflation around the world, and the way you export your deflation, because countries want inflation because they want nominal growth to create jobs and pay off the debt. So what they try to do is export the deflation through the exchange rate. Now, they have been exporting the deflation to the United States for years with a lower yuan, cheaper yuan against the dollar. But that was running into problems because the U.S. was printing so many dollars. They had to print yuan to soak up the dollar, so they were actually getting some inflation in China. That has cooled off a lot lately. So, but the same thing is true. It's actually a reflection of the fact that as China puts more and more money into Europe, and the trade ties deepen, the financial ties deepen, that more of that will start to rub off on Europe. Now, having said that, China has a strong bid for the euro and a weaker bid for the dollar, so I would expect that, again, this deflation is going to be heading our way, meaning the United States more so than Europe. But there's no question that China is importing deflation to the entire world through the exchange rate mechanism. That's what the currency wars are all about.
Jim, it's always such a pleasure talking to you. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
The other thing I would add is that, you know, we have a lot of geopolitical experts over here and we have a lot of financial experts over here, and they're brilliant people, but I think investors and analysts need to think of it as a Venn diagram where they intersect. You need to wear both hats at once, because the geopolitics and the financial economics are getting so entangled, you really can't understand one without the other.
That was author and economist Jim Rickards. Time now for a quick break, but stick around, because when we return, we are not done talking about Europe. Dennis Gartman, publisher of the Gartman Letter, is on to give his take on where that continent's economy is headed. And in today's Big Deal, Redacted Tonight contributor John F. O'Donnell is here to talk about debt and how it seems it's a hole that many Americans cannot climb out of. As we go to the break, here are the closing numbers at the bell.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
I'm the resident, and I know words are powerful. Words like cheap, as in people who buy the crap our media sells us are acting like a bunch of sheep. Or words like greedy, as in our entire financial system is rigged by a bunch of greedy jerks. Or words like consumers, as in there's more to life than just being gluttonous consumers. I'm the resident, and I'm fighting idiocy one carefully chosen word at a time.
Okay, we're back now. While sanctions on Russia have clearly had a negative economic impact, there hasn't been much of a negative political effect. And given the state of the economy in Europe, it's not clear that sanctions will remain in place or be lifted. To explore this issue, Aaron talked to noted economist Dennis Gartman. Gartman is a capital markets expert and the editor and publisher of the Gartman Letter. She asked him what he believes Europe's next move will be in terms of sanctions on Russia. Here's what he had to say.
No, I think they'll end up pushing forward with more sanctions. I think they don't have any choice at this point. They've crossed the Rubicon as far as sanctions are concerned. They're beginning to see that they are having an impact upon Moscow, and with the collapse in oil prices, that's the clearest evidence that that's what's happening. I think they'll continue to press forward with even more sanctions. Putin right now has, 82, 85% public support, and that's understandable given what's gone on in Ukraine. But if Rosneft has to come to the government for a $42 billion loan to accommodate itself, the other parts of the Russian economy are going to be under very severe strains, and the support numbers for Mr. Putin, maybe a month or two from now, will end up going down below 70% relatively quickly. It's not surprising that they've held up thus far, but because of what's going on in Ukraine, people always become patriotic and always come to the support of the leader of every country in an environment like that. But as long as, if this continues and if crude oil stays down, if food prices start to get higher, if goods begin to disappear off the shelves, his public support numbers will fall off the edge of a cliff.
Now, I also noticed that Russian Urals crude, that fell below $100 a barrel, and Reuters claims that the Russian budget is predicated on balancing at $114 a barrel. Yep. Now, given that companies, like you said, Rosneft, are asking as much as $42 billion in support because of these sanctions, that's obviously a problem for Russia, but what can they do to get out of this other than stop doing what they're doing in Ukraine?
Let me think. They should stop doing what they're doing in Ukraine. That would solve the problem very quickly. Think about it. If you're Russia, and your whole budget is predicated, and it really is predicated upon $100 plus crude oil. Pick a number, whatever it is. Let's call it 110 and leave it go at that. And now you have the Kurds, who, to put it in the colloquial expression, stole their oil fair and square from Iraq. If you're a Kurd, you're selling crude oil as much as you can because you have no fixed cost, you have no inherent costs in the oil that you can sell. You will sell it at any price because you're going to get, whatever you get is free money. You're going to sell it to Glencore, you're going to sell it to Vitol, you're going to sell it to Gunvor. One of them is going to take it at a terrible discount. Mm-hmm. Russian crude oil prices are going to follow that discount. So your real enemy at this point are the Kurds, and you've kind of made them angry.
Now, global oil prices, not just Urals crude, but Brent, WTI, Maya, and Saudi Light, they have all been falling despite the conflict in Ukraine and problems in Iraq. So is this about demand destruction, economic weakness, or booming oil supplies? What is this about?
I think it's really about booming oil supplies more than demand destruction. And there's not that much demand destruction, although there is some at the margin. We in the United States, for example, are driving less now than we drove in 2005 before the recession. We're learning how to drive more effectively, and our cars are so much more efficient than they were before. As I like to say, when I got my first car in 1966, it was a wonderful Plymouth Valiant. It was a great car. I loved that car. It was an economy car. It got 9 miles to the gallon. My car now is a Jaguar that's 10 years old. It gets 28 miles to the gallon, and my wife's new BMW gets about 35 miles to the gallon. So we're driving less and using less gasoline. There is demand destruction. But on the other side, I think the real characteristic of the oil market is supply. Supply is coming everywhere. God was not so surreptitious as to make only the United States capable of fracking for new crude oil. The Chinese are fracking. The Germans have given up on fracking. They ought not, but they will. The English are beginning to frack. The French are going to frack. Russia is fracking. We are finding so much crude oil around the world. As I've said in speech after speech, this is a very esoteric economic term. There's a gob of $112 to $15 crude in the world. We're going to go down and find out how much $80 crude there is before we shut off supply. So I think it really is a supply increase rather than demand destruction that's taking place.
What's going on elsewhere in the commodity space, and is it reflective of global growth or weakness?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is how weak grain prices have been. Corn prices have plunged, wheat prices have plunged, soybean prices have plunged. I don't think it's a matter of demand that has been destroyed, but it's simply a fact that the weather has been perfect. Despite what Al Gore has warned us about, there is no such thing as global warming. This is global moderation. And most of the crop areas in the world, with possibly the exception of India, which has not gotten as much rain in the monsoon as they'd like, but they've gotten a reasonable amount of it, grain production around the world is extraordinarily large. And we're better at it. Our scientists have created much more drought-resistant corn, much more drought-resistant, disease-resistant beans and wheat. In speech after speech that I've made, I like to tell people that we have to change the lyrics in the United States. We can't talk about the amber waves of grain anymore because we have genetically engineered the wheat crop. Instead of being 4 feet tall, we've engineered it to where it's only 2 feet tall so that the wheat crop doesn't grow the wheat stalk, it grows the wheat kernel. God bless the universities and the companies who have been able to genetically do these sorts of things. So you
yes,
put
but
downward
they might
pressure.
be poisoning us in the process.
No, I don't.
We don't know, but we just don't
argue.
know. Like you and I, we're not scientists. Like these are genetically modified foods. Just because they don't grow as tall doesn't mean they're better for you. I'm not saying that they're worse for you. The fact of the matter is we don't know today.
Well, I will take exception to that. We've been growing genetically modified wheat now for 15 years, and I haven't grown a third eye yet.
Right, but your grandkids might. No, I'm joking.
I doubt it.
You don't know. Dennis, I have one last question for you. How about the about precious metals? What are you seeing there?
It's boring, isn't it? Gold just seems to be anchored in dollar terms at or near $1,300 an ounce. I've been bullish of gold in terms of yen and bullish of gold in terms of the euro, but that's only because I see gold as being nothing more than another currency. And I tend, as a currency dealer, I tend to cross one currency against another. But gold is boring, and there really isn't an inflationary impetus out there. With crude oil prices collapsing, with grain prices collapsing, with livestock prices now collapsing at the same time, which is very interesting, with cotton prices falling, with steel prices down, how can gold stage a major rally? It just can't do it. It can't get out of its own way. Yes, I understand that the bank here in the United States and the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada and even some of the banks in Australia and New Zealand have been expansionary, but it doesn't seem to give rise to higher gold prices. The gold bugs have been arguing bullishly for months and months that gold should be soaring because of the central bank intervention, and it just hasn't happened. So I think I think gold is an extraordinarily boring circumstance right now.
That was Dennis Gartman, editor and publisher of the Gartman Letter. Time now for today's big deal. Big deal time. And today's big deal, I am joined by John F. O'Donnell of Redacted Tonight here on RT. And we are going to talk about debt. First, let me run some fun facts and figures on Ferguson fines by you. How's that for alliteration? Now, in Ferguson, Missouri, there are over 21,000 residents, about 8,200 households, 22% of which are below the poverty line. There, they have $2.6 million in court fees and fines and 24,000 arrests. Now, here's the money quote from Alex Tabarrok, who's an economics professor at George Mason. You don't get $321 in fines and fees and 3 warrants per household from an about average crime rate. You get numbers like this from BS arrests like jaywalking and constant low-level harassment involving traffic stops, court appearances, high fines, and the threat of jail for failure to pay.
Wow.
So, John, it looks like the background story for Ferguson is really about a county or a city that is milking its residents like they're, a cash machine.
I mean, first of all, it's got to be really bad if economists are using curse words to describe it. They don't typically do that, number one. And I've heard that isn't something crazy like 30% of the city of Ferguson's revenue comes from just these scofflaw offenses, if they're even that, and things like that.
It's the #2 revenue source is what they found.
That's unbelievable. That's unbelievable. I mean, it seems like it's just like instead of people being innocent until proven guilty, it's just they're just guilty for living there, and they're going to get caught, and then they're going to just be essentially robbed of money. That's awful.
That's why I wanted to talk to you today. I understand you have your hands on a document called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual. And that sounds pretty intriguing. Tell me, what's in this document?
First of all, I like the way that you framed today, because it sounds like I got my hands on this document that reveals the truth about what's going on. But in a lot of ways, it actually does. This document is pretty amazing. It was created by this anonymous group of activists and writers and academics, and it's a combined effort between StrikeDebt.org and Occupy Wall Street. And it was written in response to this 2008 economic collapse, and it really explains what's going on with all of these different types of debt and gives a lot of pointers and tips on how to stay out of debt, how to repair it if you're in it, and it really explains kind of context and history and this stuff. And we don't understand all of the ins and outs of what's going on, but we do know as a country we're largely in debt, and it is you know, some say undermining democracy and hurting us.
You know, interesting you would say that. We have a thing up here in terms of the types of debt that it has. Can you go through, like, what kind of debt are we talking about?
Absolutely. Well, obviously, it covers a lot about number 5 there, housing debt and stuff like that, and the mortgage and situation, and gives some context and history in that. What's really interesting, it does, you know, student debt, medical debt, credit card debt, and the credit score and consumer reporting agencies. These organizations are very secretive for whatever kind of algorithm they use to decide what these scores people are going to get. And a score, they say in the book, it's almost like a barcode on you. It's like a tattoo of what sort of economic things you're going to be able to have access to and achieve and things like that. And the 3 major credit bureau or credit checking agencies, they made profits in 2009 of $6.7 billion. In a lot of other countries, these are public institutions and things like that.
Right, right. Well, you know, I understand a lot of people's credit scores suffer even when they're not in a whole lot of debt. What kind of DIY type of stuff can you do to make sure that your credit report is good for you?
Well, you're absolutely right. First of all, what happens is a lot of times there's errors all over this place. You know, where sometimes it'll be like, oh, this is somebody else that isn't me that has this kind of delinquent thing going on.
Right. Once my dad, who has the same name as me, I saw that his debt was actually on my credit report.
Really?
Yeah.
See, I wish the reverse would happen for me because my dad has the same name but better credit. You know what I mean? But yeah, so some things that people can do in a DIY capacity. First thing to know is there is a way to sort of game the credit card system. It's as in not getting tricked by these teaser rates. As in you shop around, you look for which credit card has the best introductory rates. Let's say it's 6 months of no interest, of interest-free with some sort of rewards for using, you know, system or something like that. What you do is you use that credit card right up until that time, and then you either close it or you pay it off completely, and then you use another one, and you just keep gaming them and establishing credit and, you know, not have to pay any interest. But if you're already in trouble, what you have to do is, you know, you have to get your credit reports. You have to make sure that everything's correct. More often than not, it's not going to be correct. So what you do is you have to write to the, you know, the corresponding appropriate companies and our bureau, and then keep fighting for them to correct it, and eventually will, and your score can improve.
You know, we only have about 15 seconds now, but tell me about Redacted Tonight.
Okay, well, I'm a political correspondent on Redacted Tonight. It's RT America's a new comedy show where every Friday at 8, Lee Camp hosts it. Our newest show is going to be Lee covering the militarization of police in a funny way. I'm talking about Obama being slammed by Hillary in a funny way, and it's going to be fun. Follow us at Redacted Tonight at Twitter.
Excellent. We got to go, but we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
You bet.